Looking at me now. Looking at me now. It's the way you feel. Looking at me now. The way you are. Looking at me now, looking at me the way you are. Feeling this, feeling that. Looking at me now, touching you. Looking at me, going at you. Looking at me, riding around you. Looking at me, going on. You got it going on. You have been rolling. Looking at me now, looking at me the way you are. Looking at me the way you have it. Looking at me the way you feel. Looking at me, I'll touch you. Looking at me now. Can you believe it now? Looking at me, feel you up. Looking at me the way you are. Looking at me 100%. Looking at me 100%. Looking at me now, looking at me the way you are. Looking at me the way you are in my heart. Looking at me the way you are in my heart. Looking at me some way. Looking at me, feeling this way. Looking at me, knowing this way. Looking at me the way you are. Looking at me the way you feel it. Looking at me now. Feeling it now. Looking at me, feeling you. Looking at me, it's all good. Looking at me, looking at me. Looking at me, what's wrong with you? Looking at me, why do you keep on staring? Looking at me now, that's the way you feel. Looking at me the way. Looking at me in my face. Looking at me on your way. Looking at me at your wings. Looking at me wasting away. Looking at me the way you are. If I could ever teach you a lesson, if I could ever know you were there. Looking at me now, it's fair. Looking at me, it's all done.